My daughter-in-law sat in my kitchen and informed me that I no longer needed the master bedroom in my own house. She genuinely believed she was taking over, but what she failed to understand was that every rule in this home still belonged to me. My husband and I had built this house 30 years earlier, brick by brick, in a quiet wooded suburb outside Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I wasn't about to be pushed aside by someone who had only been living here for 6 months. Meredith sat at my kitchen table tapping away on her expensive iPhone while absent-mindedly pushing aside the homemade cookies I had baked that morning. Across from her, my son Garrett stared down at his sneakers the moment she began speaking. "We need to talk about the layout of the house," Evelyn, she said without even bothering to look up. "That master bedroom upstairs is honestly wasted on just one person. You spend the whole day in the garden or down here in the kitchen anyway. A smaller room on the main floor would be more than enough for you." I continued washing my coffee mug in silence. The water running over my hands was warm, but Meredith's words carried a chill that settled deep in my chest. She and Garrett had moved in half a year earlier, supposedly so they could save for a down payment on a place of their own. Instead of saving, however, Meredith had gradually begun trying to control the rhythm of my household, and Garrett had done absolutely nothing to stop it. He had never been good at setting boundaries, not with me, and certainly not with his wife, and over time he had become little more than a passive observer in his own life. "A smaller room is plenty of space for a bed and a few clothes," Meredith added with a sharp laugh, as though she were making an innocent joke. It wasn't a joke. It was a carefully calculated attempt to turn me into a guest in the home I owned. She probably assumed that a widow in her 60s would eventually give in for the sake of keeping the peace, but life had taught me something very different. Peace never comes from surrendering yourself. I dried my hands carefully with a dish towel turned around, met Meredith's gaze, and offered her a faint smile. "I'll think about it, Meredith," I said calmly. Garrett immediately exhaled in relief, grateful that there wasn't going to be an argument. What neither of them understood was that my apparent agreement meant nothing. After they went upstairs that evening, I remained at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet. If someone intended to rewrite the rules of my home, they were eventually going to discover that those rules still belonged to me, and the process of reminding them would begin the very next morning. Meredith and Garrett came downstairs around 7, expecting the usual breakfast that always seemed to appear without effort. Instead, the table was completely empty. There were no fresh bagels from the bakery, no butter, and no pot of coffee waiting for them. The only thing sitting in the morning sunlight was a neatly written legal pad beside my old calculator, while I sat by the window reading the newspaper and sipping a cup of black tea. "Where's breakfast?" Meredith asked irritably as she opened the refrigerator. The fridge was nearly empty because before either of them woke up, I had already moved all of my groceries into the locked chest refrigerator in the basement. "We're changing how things work around here starting today," I replied evenly. "Since both of you are adults with full-time jobs, we're going to operate as separate households. Here's an itemized breakdown of the utilities and household expenses from the last 6 months. I slid the legal pad toward Garrett. Every expense was listed there: electricity, gas, water, trash collection, and every other household cost, all divided equally and calculated back to the day they moved in. Garrett's expression changed the moment he saw the total. He had never paid attention to those numbers because I had quietly absorbed them for months without complaint. Meredith let out a strained laugh. "This is ridiculous, Evelyn. We're family. We're sharing a house." "Exactly," I replied. "We're sharing the house, which means we share the responsibilities and the expenses. Since you were concerned about the amount of space the master bedroom occupies, your portion certainly doesn't get any smaller. In fact, the two of you use most of the utilities in this house." Her face immediately turned red. She wanted the benefits of the space, but had conveniently forgotten that space comes with costs. After a long silence, Garrett reached into his wallet and placed $200 on the table. It was a beginning, but it was far from the end of the conversation. Meredith pushed back her chair, stormed out of the kitchen without another word, and disappeared upstairs while I calmly returned to my tea. The first move had been made, but I knew something much larger was hiding beneath the surface. Whatever Meredith was really after, it had nothing to do with a bedroom, and sooner or later, the truth was going to reveal itself. Before we continue, welcome back to the Quiet Revenge Stories channel. If you enjoy real-life family drama, quiet revenge stories, and powerful lessons about self-respect and boundaries, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now let's get back to what happened next. The atmosphere inside the house changed noticeably within the next 48 hours. Meredith decided that her response to the utility breakdown would be silence, but it wasn't the peaceful kind. She stopped speaking to me unless absolutely necessary and only cooked meals for herself and Garrett. At the same time, she deliberately left dirty dishes stacked in the sink, apparently convinced that I would eventually wash them out of habit. I never touched a single one. Instead, I gathered every plate, bowl, and glass she left behind and arranged them neatly on the floor outside their bedroom door upstairs. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a speech. The dishes spoke for themselves. By Thursday afternoon, I received confirmation that my instincts about Meredith had been correct all along. I was trimming roses in the front yard when I heard the unmistakable rumble of a delivery truck pulling into the driveway. Curious, I looked up and watched two movers unload a brand new sectional sofa along with an enormous flat-screen television. Standing nearby with her arms folded and an expression of complete satisfaction, Meredith directed the entire operation as though she owned the property. The moment I stepped inside, I realized exactly what she was doing. The new furniture wasn't intended for their upstairs rooms. It was intended for my living room. For 30 years, that room had held family holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, and countless memories with my husband. Now Meredith was attempting to erase all of that and replace it with a version of the house that suited her preferences. Her disrespect became impossible to ignore when the movers started pushing my armchairs aside and prepared to move the upright piano that had belonged to my late husband. "Stop right there," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough authority that both movers froze immediately. "This furniture is not staying here." Meredith walked toward me and crossed her arms. "We need room for our lifestyle, Evelyn. Your old furniture is taking up the entire space." I looked directly past her and addressed the movers. "I am the sole owner of this property, and I did not authorize this delivery." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was obvious they had no desire to become involved in a family conflict, and a few moments later, Garrett arrived home from work and walked directly into the middle of the situation. He looked from the new furniture to me, and then to Meredith, already aware that something had gone very wrong. "Mom, come on. It's just a couch," he said uncertainly. I looked at him and felt no anger, only disappointment. "It's my couch, my living room, and my house, Garrett. If Meredith bought new furniture, then it needs to fit in your bedroom upstairs." The meaning of my words was impossible to misunderstand. Within minutes, the movers began loading everything back onto the truck. Meredith stood there furious, watching her plans disappear one piece at a time, while I quietly returned to the kitchen. She believed the battle was about furniture, but I already suspected the real issue was something much larger. The answer arrived the very next morning. I was sorting through the mail near the front entrance, something Garrett normally handled, when I noticed a thick envelope from a major national bank addressed to Meredith. The envelope had come partially unsealed during delivery, and one corner of the document inside was visible. I had no intention of snooping through anyone's private business, but the page was practically sliding out on its own. What I saw immediately caught my attention. It was a final notice regarding an unpaid personal loan. The amount owed was $15,000. Suddenly, every strange piece of behavior over the previous 6 months started fitting together. Their supposed effort to save for a house, Meredith's obsession with controlling my property, her outrage over contributing to household expenses, and her determination to secure more space inside the house, all pointed toward the same conclusion. They weren't building a future. At least Meredith wasn't. She was drowning in debt. She hadn't been trying to claim the master bedroom because she needed more room. She had been trying to establish permanent roots inside a home she didn't own. The house wasn't her goal. The security it provided was. Without touching anything else, I placed the envelope neatly on the entry table where it would be impossible to miss. Then I settled into my favorite chair and continued knitting as though nothing had happened. When Meredith came home later that afternoon, she spotted the envelope instantly. The color drained from her face. She snatched it from the table, looked at me, and for a brief moment I saw genuine fear in her eyes. I didn't say a word. I simply continued knitting, allowing the silence to do all the work for me. Sometimes silence is far more powerful than confrontation. That evening, I heard tense whispers coming from their room upstairs. The conversation stopped whenever I passed through the hallway, but it was obvious that something had changed. Meredith understood that the cracks in her carefully constructed image were beginning to show, and she was desperately trying to keep everything from falling apart. The truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried. By the end of that week, I could already feel it moving closer. The game wasn't over yet, but for the first time since Meredith moved into my home, I knew exactly where the real weakness in her position existed. And once you know where the foundation is cracked, you don't need to tear the whole house down. You simply wait for the pressure to do the work for you. The weekend settled over the house like a heavy fog. Meredith seemed determined to regain control of the situation, but instead of addressing the growing tension directly, she resorted to small, irritating disruptions. If I entered the kitchen at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, she would somehow manage to occupy the entire space, spreading ingredients across every available surface, while preparing elaborate meals that she never once offered to share. It was a childish attempt to provoke a reaction, but I had lived through far more difficult things than passive-aggressive behavior, and I refused to let it dictate my mood. Rather than engage, I adjusted my routine. I started leaving the house earlier, driving downtown for breakfast at a small diner near the market, and spending time with friends I hadn't seen in years. The change did me good. While Meredith remained focused on creating tension inside the house, I found myself enjoying the freedom that came from no longer organizing my days around her behavior. Every morning away from that atmosphere reminded me that peace is often easier to create than people realize. Back at home, however, another issue was becoming impossible to ignore. Winter was approaching, and the heating bill sitting on the kitchen table remained untouched. Garrett and Meredith had yet to contribute their share, despite several reminders. So one afternoon I went down to the basement and adjusted the thermostat controls. The upstairs zone was reduced to the legal minimum temperature while the main floor remained comfortable. It wasn't revenge. It was simple mathematics. If people weren't contributing to the cost of heating the house, they weren't entitled to unlimited comfort. When I returned later that day, I found Garrett wrapped in a thick fleece blanket on the couch. "Mom, is the furnace broken?" he asked. "No, Garrett," I replied as I hung up my coat. "The heating system works perfectly. Since your share of the winter fuel delivery hasn't been paid yet, we're all making adjustments. I'm simply wearing a heavier sweater downstairs." Before he could respond, Meredith came storming out of the hallway. "This is cruel," she snapped. "You can't just freeze us out." I met her glare without raising my voice. "I'm not freezing anyone out. The bill has been on the kitchen table for days. Pay your portion, and the temperature goes back up. That's how life works when adults share expenses." For a moment, she stood there, speechless. Meredith had expected arguments, emotional outbursts, or eventually surrender. What she couldn't handle was consistency. Every complaint she made ran directly into the same wall responsibility. The more calmly I enforced it, the less power she seemed to have. What interested me far more was Garrett's reaction. As he looked from me to Meredith and back again, I could almost see the realization forming behind his eyes. For months he had accepted every explanation she offered without question. Now little cracks were beginning to appear. The unpaid loan, the utility arguments, the furniture incident, and the constant resistance to contributing financially were no longer isolated events. Even Garrett was beginning to notice the pattern. The following Tuesday, Meredith made what would ultimately become her biggest mistake. Without warning, she invited her mother Beatrice over to the house. Beatrice was the kind of woman who dominated every room she entered. Loud, opinionated, and convinced of her own authority, she clearly arrived with a purpose. Meredith had brought reinforcements. Together, the three of them settled into the living room, drinking coffee from my good china and speaking loudly enough that I could hear every word from the hallway when I returned from my afternoon walk. "You need to step aside for the younger generation," Evelyn Beatrice declared. "You've lived your life already. Right now, you're standing in the way of your son's future." I took off my shoes, walked calmly into the room, and settled into my armchair. After pouring myself a cup of coffee, I looked directly at Beatrice and smiled politely. "Beatrice, I'm glad you're taking such an interest in their future," I said. "I assume that means you're here to help Meredith deal with her finances. $15,000 in bank debt is a substantial burden for a young couple trying to buy a house." The reaction was immediate. The coffee cup in Meredith's hand rattled against the saucer. Beatrice froze mid-breath, and Garrett practically launched himself out of his chair. "What?" he asked. "What debt?" The color drained from Meredith's face so quickly that she looked ill. "I don't know anything about a loan," Garrett continued, staring at his wife in disbelief. "I never raised my voice, and I never needed to. The truth was already doing the work for me." Meredith looked at me with pure fury, but she couldn't deny what had happened, because she knew exactly which document I was referring to. Beatrice attempted to recover. "That is none of your business." "Oh, it became my business the moment my home started being treated like a financial rescue plan," I replied evenly. "Garrett, if you don't know the condition of your own household finances, I think it's time you started asking questions." With that, I picked up my coffee and walked back into the kitchen. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. The consequences lasted much longer. That night, sleep was impossible upstairs. The walls in the house were thick, but Garrett's voice carried clearly enough for me to hear the anger and betrayal in every word. For the first time, he was confronting facts instead of excuses. He had genuinely believed they were working together toward a shared future, only to discover that while he was planning, Meredith had been hiding debt and quietly positioning herself to depend on my house as a safety net. By the time the argument finally died down sometime after midnight, I knew the balance of power inside the house had changed forever. The truth was no longer hidden, and once the truth enters a room, it rarely leaves quietly. The next morning, I found Garrett sitting alone at the kitchen table long before sunrise. He looked exhausted, as though he hadn't slept at all. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him while he stared blankly at the pattern on the tablecloth, and when I took a seat across from him, he couldn't even bring himself to meet my eyes. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" he asked quietly. "Her secrets weren't mine to tell Garrett," I replied. "But if we're being honest, you could have discovered the truth yourself months ago. You spent so much time avoiding conflict that you stopped paying attention to what was happening right in front of you. You let her disrespect me in my own house because it felt easier than having an argument." He lowered his head and released a long, weary sigh. "She handled everything," he admitted. "The accounts, the bills, our schedule. I really thought she was looking out for us." "She was looking out for herself," I said gently. "Now you know the facts. What you do with them is your decision, but this house isn't a bank, and it's certainly not a bailout fund for someone else's mistakes." Garrett nodded slowly. For the first time in months, he seemed willing to hear things he had spent a long time avoiding. Meredith never came downstairs that morning. She stayed locked inside their room while Garrett left for work, carrying a burden far heavier than the one he had brought home the day before. Before leaving, he washed his own coffee cup and placed it in the dishwasher without being asked. It was a small gesture, but after everything that had happened, it felt significant. The dynamic inside the house had shifted not because of shouting or threats, but because reality had finally forced its way into the open. 2 days later, I made my next move. I drove to a local locksmith and arranged to have the deadbolts on both exterior doors replaced. As the sole owner of the property, I had every legal right to do so, and after everything that had happened, I was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. The work was completed before noon, and by the time Meredith returned from work that evening, her key no longer fit the lock. I heard the rattling first. Then came the pounding. A few moments later, I opened the front door just enough for the security chain to hold it in place. "What is the meaning of this, Evelyn?" she demanded. Her composure was completely gone. "I can't get in. Have you lost your mind?" "Not at all," I replied pleasantly. "I've simply upgraded the security system. Since your share of the utilities and household expenses remains unpaid, your access privileges are suspended until the balance is settled." her face twisted with disbelief. "You can't do that." I already did. Then I added the detail I knew would affect her most. "I stopped by Garrett's office this morning and gave him a new key. He paid his share in cash." For a moment, she just stared at me. The realization hit her immediately. Garrett was no longer standing behind her automatically. For the first time since moving into my house, she was standing alone. "You can't lock me out of my own home," she hissed. "This isn't your home," I replied calmly. "The deed is in my name. Garrett has a key because he fulfilled his responsibilities. If you'd like the same privilege, you know exactly what needs to happen. Otherwise, you're welcome to wait for him to come home." The autumn wind whipped through the porch while warm air drifted comfortably from the house behind me. The contrast wasn't lost on either of us. Or I continued, "You could use the time to start thinking about your next living arrangement. Guests who repeatedly disrespect their host eventually wear out their welcome." Without another word, I closed the door and slid the bolt into place. A few seconds later, I heard her heels striking the driveway as she stormed back toward her car. The house immediately felt calmer. Not triumphant, just peaceful. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Garrett walked through the front door carrying a large duffel bag. He looked tired, but there was a steadiness about him that hadn't been there in a long time. After pouring him a glass of ice water, I sat across from him at the kitchen table while he gathered his thoughts. "She's staying at her mother's place," he said. "We talked on the phone. It's over." I simply nodded. "She wants her belongings." "Her belongings are already packed," I replied. "Everything is labeled and stacked by the basement door so nothing gets lost." The surprise on his face quickly gave way to a faint, exhausted smile. "You really thought of everything." "I had plenty of time." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Garrett looked down at the table. "Mom, you never yelled. You never threatened anyone. And somehow you still managed to take control of the entire situation." I folded my hands in front of me. "There are no winners here, Garrett. There are only consequences. Meredith's mistake was assuming that age makes people weak. Your mistake was standing by and allowing her behavior because confronting it felt uncomfortable." His eyes filled with regret. "I know. I spent years caring for your father through illness," I continued. "I've lived through real hardship. A woman with a bad attitude and hidden debt was never going to break me." Garrett nodded quietly. Then, after a long silence, he finally said the words I had been waiting to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it." I looked at him carefully before answering. "Apologies matter, but they aren't enough on their own. What matters now is what you do next." He understood exactly what I meant. The conversation that followed wasn't emotional or dramatic. Instead, it felt more like an agreement between two adults. Garrett could remain in the house temporarily while he searched for an apartment, but there would be clear expectations. He would pay his expenses on time, respect my privacy, and accept that decisions about the house belonged entirely to me. When he reached across the table and shook my hand, it wasn't a sentimental gesture. It was an acknowledgement of boundaries. And for the first time in a very long while, those boundaries were finally being respected. The weeks that followed were surprisingly calm. Once Meredith left the house, the constant tension that had lingered in every room seemed to disappear with her. Garrett kept his word and respected the conditions we had agreed upon. He paid his share of the household expenses on time cleaned up after himself, and gradually began participating in the responsibilities he had ignored for months. The change wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. And consistency, I had learned long ago, reveals far more about a person's character than promises ever do. For the first few days, Garrett moved through the house like someone recovering from a storm. He spent long evenings reviewing financial records, speaking with attorneys, and untangling details of a marriage that had been built on far less honesty than he once believed. I didn't interfere. Some lessons can only be learned by living through them, and my role was no longer to rescue him from every difficult situation. One evening, he joined me on the back porch while I watered the flower beds. "I keep replaying everything in my head," he admitted. "Looking back, the signs were there from the beginning." I set the watering can aside and sat down. They usually are. I just didn't want to see them. No, I said gently. You didn't want the conflict that came with seeing them. He nodded. That answer seemed to resonate more deeply than anything else we had discussed. Over the following weeks, I noticed small changes. Garrett started managing his own finances, asking questions before making decisions, and taking responsibility for things he would once have ignored. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was genuine. Every time I saw him making an effort instead of searching for an excuse, I felt a little more hopeful about the future. Meanwhile, Meredith remained at her mother's house. Aside from a few logistical messages regarding her belongings and the divorce process, there was very little contact. The drama she once brought into every corner of my life had finally moved somewhere else, and I had no desire to follow it. A month later, she returned one final time to collect the last of her possessions. The visit lasted less than 20 minutes. She arrived with Beatrice loaded the remaining boxes into an SUV and avoided looking at me whenever possible. The confidence that had once filled every room she entered was gone, replaced by a strained silence that seemed to follow her everywhere. I stood on the porch while they worked. Neither of us had anything left to say. Sometimes a situation reaches a point where every important conversation has already happened. When the final box disappeared into the vehicle, Meredith paused briefly near the driveway. "You really enjoyed this, didn't you?" she asked. I looked at her calmly. No, I would have preferred that none of it happened. For a moment, she seemed as though she wanted to argue. Then she simply got into the passenger seat and closed the door. A few seconds later, they drove away. And that chapter of my life was finally over. The house felt noticeably different after that. Not because it was quieter, although it certainly was, but because it felt like mine again. The living room remained exactly as my husband and I had designed it. The piano sat in its usual place, the familiar furniture stayed where it belonged, and every room reflected memories that had been earned rather than imposed. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Garrett found a small apartment downtown. The day he moved out, he loaded his belongings into a rented truck and spent most of the afternoon carrying boxes down the driveway. Unlike the day Meredith left, there was no bitterness hanging in the air. It felt less like an ending and more like a necessary next step. When everything was packed, he walked back into the kitchen one last time. "Well," he said with a nervous smile, "I guess this is it." "For now," I replied. He looked around the room. "I never thanked you." "You don't need to." "Yes, I do." I waited. "Thank you for not giving up on me when it would have been easier to throw me out with her." The words hung in the air for several seconds. Then I smiled. "Just make good decisions from here." "I will." This time I believed him. A few minutes later, he hugged me, picked up his keys, and headed toward the door. I watched from the front window as he climbed into the truck and drove away. Unlike the departures that had come before this, one didn't leave behind sadness. It left behind pride. My son wasn't running away from responsibility anymore. He was finally moving toward it. And as I stood there watching the truck disappear down the road, I realized that sometimes the most important thing a parent can do isn't protecting a child from consequences. It's allowing those consequences to teach the lessons that love alone never could. 3 months later, the house had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. The silence that once seemed unsettling after my husband's passing had become something comforting again. Without constant tension hanging over every conversation, I found myself enjoying simple routines that had been overshadowed for far too long. Mornings began with coffee in the kitchen, afternoons were spent in the garden, and evenings often ended with a good book in the reading room that had once been the master bedroom everyone seemed so eager to claim. Garrett had moved into a small apartment downtown and was adjusting surprisingly well to life on his own. The divorce was progressing quietly through mediation, and for the most part, I stayed out of it. He came over every other Sunday for dinner, always arriving on time and always carrying a fresh bouquet of flowers. Those visits felt different from the interactions we had shared during the previous year because they were built on mutual respect rather than obligation. One Sunday evening after we finished dinner, Garrett helped me clear the table before we settled onto the back porch with coffee. "You know," he said thoughtfully, I used to think keeping the peace meant avoiding conflict at all costs. I smiled. A lot of people think that. But all I really did was create bigger problems by refusing to deal with smaller ones. The observation caught me by surprise. Not because it was wrong, because it was exactly right. For a long moment we sat quietly watching the sunset settle over the backyard. "I should have stood up for you sooner," he added. Maybe I replied. But sometimes people have to learn lessons for themselves. The important thing is that you learned it before it was too late. He nodded, and neither of us felt the need to say anything more. As spring arrived, the house continued to transform. The reading room upstairs became my favorite place in the entire house. Sunlight poured through the large windows every morning, illuminating shelves filled with books, photographs, and small reminders of a life that had been built through decades of work and perseverance. Whenever I sat there with a cup of coffee, I was reminded how close I had come to surrendering pieces of that life, simply because someone else believed they were entitled to them. One bright Tuesday morning, I found myself sitting in the kitchen while a fresh pot of coffee brewed on the counter. The familiar aroma drifted through the house, and outside the window the first snowdrops of the season were beginning to emerge from the ground. I reached for one of the homemade cookies cooling on a tray nearby and smiled as I took a bite. This time nobody pushed them aside. Nobody criticized the way I lived. Nobody tried to tell me which rooms I deserved to occupy in my own home. The peace surrounding me wasn't the result of winning a battle. It came from refusing to surrender my place in a life I had spent decades building. Looking back, I realized that I had never needed dramatic confrontations, lawyers, or public arguments to reclaim control of my home. What I needed was a clear understanding of my own worth and the willingness to defend it consistently. People often believe strength is loud. They imagine it arrives through ultimatums, shouting matches, or grand displays of power. In my experience, real strength is usually much quieter. It's the ability to hold your ground without losing your dignity, to enforce boundaries without cruelty, and to remain steady when others are counting on you to give in. As I looked out across the garden, watching new flowers push their way through the soil after a long winter, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I had protected my home, preserved my independence, and helped my son find his way back to himself. None of it had happened through anger. It had happened through patience, consistency, and the refusal to compromise on principles that mattered. The winter had finally passed, both outside and within these walls. My house belonged to me again. My life had regained its balance, and the future felt brighter than it had in years. Sitting there with my coffee and the morning sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor, I understood something that Meredith never had. A home isn't defined by the room you occupy. It's defined by the respect you bring into it. And as long as I was living under this roof, respect would always be the foundation everything else was built upon. Looking back now, I realized the master bedroom was never really the issue. It was simply the moment that revealed a much deeper problem. Little by little, I had allowed kindness to become expectation, and expectation had slowly turned into entitlement. The day Meredith suggested that I no longer needed my own room was the day I finally understood how much of myself I had been giving away in the name of keeping the peace. What happened afterward wasn't revenge in the way most people imagine it. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic ultimatums, and no attempts to hurt anyone. I simply stopped carrying responsibilities that were never mine to begin with and allowed the truth to stand on its own. Once that happened, everyone was forced to face the consequences of their choices. These days, Garrett and I have a healthier relationship than we've had in years because it's built on honesty instead of avoidance. My home feels warm again. My routines belong to me. And every room reflects a life that was earned through decades of hard work and perseverance. Most importantly, I no longer confuse sacrifice with love. If this experience taught me anything, it's that boundaries are not acts of selfishness. They are acts of self-respect. The moment you stop handing other people the keys to your life, you finally discover how much freedom was waiting on the other side of that door. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving your strength to someone else. It's remembering it for yourself.
This story is a work of fiction inspired by real-life situations that many people experience but rarely talk about openly. While the characters and events have been shaped for storytelling, the emotions, conflicts, and choices reflect truths that exist in everyday life. At Quiet Revenge Stories channel, every story is created to explore the complexity of human relationships, especially the difficult moments that test trust boundaries and self-worth. These stories are not just about drama, but about awareness, resilience, and the courage it takes to protect yourself when it matters most. The message behind our stories is simple, but powerful. Love should never require you to lose yourself, and kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Life will sometimes place you in situations where you must choose between keeping peace and protecting your dignity, and in those moments, choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of something real, consider supporting the channel by subscribing to Quiet Revenge Stories channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, each one carrying a lesson, a reflection, or a truth worth hearing. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.